Hello everyone, this is John with ziptopia.org. Today we are continuing our RFC 3261 Simplified series with part 3. Previously we covered SIP message types, request responses, mandatory SIP message components, start line and message header, mandatory SIP header fields, to, from, C-sequence, call ID, max forwards, and via, and captured and analyzed a sample call between Tarzan and Jane to provide examples for each topic in the form of screenshots from Wireshark captures. If you haven't watched part 1 and 2, please do so now before continuing with this video. Now let's take a look under the hood and find out what user agent client and user agent server do behind the scenes. We will cover UAC in this part and UAS in the following. Here we are going to first create a SIP trapezoid seen in every single SIP document to simulate another call between Tarzan and Jane with SIP proxies instead of a back-to-back user agent, which was an asterisk now PBX. We will then find out how, why, and where UAC sends the requests. And finally, we will take a closer look at the responses defined in RFC 3261 that a UAC could receive. So in this tutorial series, the first call example between Tarzan and Jane included a back-to-back user agent, as I mentioned earlier, an asterisk now PBX in the middle. In order to simulate multiple hops with SIP proxies, Tarzan made another test call to Jane when they had two repro SIP proxies configured in between, basically creating the trapezoid shape you would see in every document about SIP. As you can see, we have two Kali instances running at the top with the repro installed, and two Kali Linux instances at the bottom with again SFL phones installed, our SIP phones. The installation of repro is so easy, I'm not even going to cover it here. You just open a terminal and type apt-get space install space repro. Now that's the installation, but the configuration is a little more tricky. So you gotta first take a look at your IP addresses. In this case, Tarzan SIP proxy has 192.168.1.6, whereas Jane's SIP proxy has .9. Now, you need to open this repro.config file, which is located at etc/repro, as you can see. And these 4 lines are the most important, I guess the minimum requirements that you need to satisfy. This is the IP address and the port that we will be listening. But with these changes you have to restart the service, and this is the command that you should use. So once you install and configure these IP addresses, you go to the IP address of the SIP proxy. It's important to note that 5080 is the default port here. So, and as you can see, the username password is admin by default. We are not using a DNS server, so we are just gonna configure the IP addresses of the SIP proxies as domains on both sides. This is the subnet that we use. Now here we added Tarzan in SIP proxy 1, whereas Jane in SIP proxy 2. So in the show route section, we said if Tarzan calls this URI, send it to, as you can see, the other SIP proxy. The IP address changes. As you can see, the test also shows the URI change. Similarly, on the right, we have the same for Tarzan. Now, when you click on the registrations, you can see that on the left we have Tarzan registered to SIP proxy 1 and Jane on SIP proxy 2. So at the bottom, as I mentioned earlier, we have our SFL phones. Let's move these Kali instances to the center to take a look at what we have running. As I mentioned, we have 4 different Kali instances. Now we are looking at the 2 that are hosting the SIP phones, the SFL phones. As you can see, Jane's SFL phone has the IP address .20. It's using the account alias Jane. And Tarzan's SIP phone is the IP address .18 and using the alias Tarzan. Now we have Wireshark ready. Let's start running it and call Jane. To keep it simple, we had put the whole URI in the route section, as you may recall. So we are calling exactly that URI. Up on the right, we do see the call coming to Jane from Tarzan. Jane answers the call. Of course, we are running virtual machines, so things are not as fast and as accurate. So Tarzan's phone is still showing ringing, so you have to excuse that. Now we have the call established. Tarzan hangs up, and now we have captured our call using the SIP trapezoid. Let's move on. So in this call, Tarzan is sitting in the jungle with an IP address of 192.168.1.18 and is using the jungle's SIP proxy, which has an IP address of 192.168.1.6. Similarly, Jane is at the camp with the IP address 192.168.1.20, and the camp is using a SIP proxy with an IP address of 192.168.1.9. The SIP proxies are also the registrars in this scenario. Tarzan is registered to SIP proxy 1 and Jane is registered to SIP proxy 2. Tarzan and Jane could have learned about their SIP proxies either by manual configuration of their SIP phone or from the HCP, if there is one, automatically when they received an IP address of their own. Here, in this scenario, we have configured them manually. Let's say we did not configure the SIP phone and all we know is how to make a call. We are just a user. Tarzan calls Jane. The SIP phone creates an invite message with the details in the screenshot here. Where does this invite message go next? The bottom line is we need an IP address, a transport layer protocol, and a port number to send this SIP message to. So, in order to find a destination for its requests, a user agent client starts with DNS procedures to resolve domain names to IP addresses. If the destination is the next hop towards the user agent server, it can be identified in the root header field. If the root header field is present, that will be used for determining where to send this message to. If there are multiple route header fields present, the one at the top would be the next hop. If there are no route header fields, the URI in the request URI of the request line would be used to determine where to send this request to. Well, since we have a route header field in our invite message here, we will use it to determine where to send this message to. Let's always keep in mind we need an IP address, a transport layer protocol to use, and a port number. If the route header field has a domain name, as we mentioned before, UAC would use DNS to try to resolve that to an IP address. We have an IP address here, but no transport layer protocol or a port number. If a transport layer protocol exists, obviously UAC would use that protocol. If it doesn't exist, UDP should be used, as it was the default transport layer protocol defined in previous RFC for SIP 2543. Again, if a transport layer protocol exists, the user agent client would use that protocol. If it doesn't exist, UDP should be used. I'm not saying must be used. UDP should be used, as it was the default transport layer protocol defined in RFC 2543. Since we don't have a transport layer protocol defined in the route header field here, UAC will be using UDP in this case. Similar to the transport layer protocol, if the route header field has a port number defined, great, the UAC would use that port. If there is no port defined in the route header field, the user agent client uses the default port number for the transport layer protocol. So, if the transport layer protocol is UDP or TCP, the default port would be 5060, whereas the default port for TLS is 5061. Again, if there is no port is defined here, the client uses the default port number for the transport layer protocol used. And we already found out which transport layer protocol is being used here. So if the transport layer protocol is UDP or TCP, the default port would be 5060, whereas the default port for TLS is 5061. So since we determined that the transport layer protocol here is UDP, the user agent client will be using the default port 5060. Therefore, the UAC sends this invite message to 192.168.1.6 using UDP port 5060. Now, by looking at the same traffic capture with more details, as you can see here, we confirm where the message is sent. As you can see in the highlighted entries, the message is sent to the IP address 192.168.1.6 using UDP, User Datagram Protocol, port 5060. Well, of course, UAC added a via header field with itself, created a globally unique SIP call ID, and set the random C sequence number to 29905 in the invite message here before sending the invite message out. Even though the root header field was pointing to the SIP proxy 1, which Tarzan is using for outbound calls, in some cases the root header field might not include the outbound SIP proxy. The user agent client should not use outbound SIP proxy for all messages. It should be skipped if the root header field does not point to the outbound SIP proxy. This might be somehow a rare case, but it is worth to know. Basically, if our SIP proxy, either manually or automatically configured SIP proxy, is not the first entry in the root header field, we should be skipping it. We should be sending our requests to the first root header field entry, even if it's not the SIP proxy we are configured to use. The key point, of course, is the should word. It's not a must. So moving on, Tarzan sent out the invite message and he is now waiting for a response. What would Tarzan's SIP phone do if the response was not what he was expecting? Well, first of all, if a UAC receives a response that it does not recognize, it should treat the response like it's the first response in its class, X00. The exception, just to mention here, is the unrecognized provisional responses, which should be treated as 183. So for example, if Tarzan received 199 early dialog terminated and his SIP phone does not recognize this response, Tarzan's phone would have processed this response as 183 session progress and waited for a final response. On the other hand, if Tarzan's phone received responses with the status code 2XX, 3XX, 4XX, 5XX, or 6XX that it does not recognize, it would have processed them as 200, 300, 400, 500, and 600 responses respectively. SIP response codes are consistent with HTTP 1.1, as we mentioned before in parts 1 and 2, but not all HTTP 1.1 response codes are used in RFC 3261. So let's go over the response codes Tarzan's phone should be familiar with. In other words, let's go over the response codes defined in RFC 3261. 1XX provisional. These are also called informational responses. They basically indicate that the entity that received the request is taking some action that will take longer than 200 milliseconds. And the final response is not ready yet. This keeps UAC from resending the request. Now let's go over these real quickly. 100 trying. The next hop received the request and it is taking some unspecified action. 180 ringing. The called party is being alerted to indicate an incoming call. 181 call is being forwarded. One of the servers on the path to the called party forwarded the call to another destination. 182 queued. The called party is temporarily unavailable, but the call is not rejected. It's queued and it will receive a final response when the called party becomes available. Multiple 182 queued responses could be received during a call with information like the number of calls in the queue and so on. 183 session progress, unless the reason phrase is something other than session progress or header fields include some information about the status of the call, this message is just letting the caller know that the call is in progress with no other details. 2xx success. This is simply the indication of a successful request. Keep in mind that in RFC 3261, 200 OK, the request was successful, is the only 2xx success response that is defined. 3xx redirection. These are responses used to inform the caller that the called party is not available at the destination URI. They come with one or more URIs in the contact header field that the caller may use to send new requests to in order to reach the called party. The caller can choose to send new requests to any of the URIs in the contact header field. The caller can send the request out serially, in any order desired, or parallel with multiple requests to different URIs at the same time. There is a method to order the URIs that the caller may choose to use. The 3xx response contact header field could include a queue value, with each URI indicating its priority. The higher the queue value is, the more preferred the URI. For example, if Tarzan called Jane at Camp 1 and received a 3xx response with the following contact header field, Jane might be in Camp 2 or Camp 3, with Camp 3 being a higher possibility. Now Tarzan's SIP phone can choose to do any of the following. Do nothing. Send a request to Camp 2 only, in hopes to reach Jane. Send a request to Camp 2 in hopes to reach Jane. If it fails, send another request to Camp 3. Send a request to Camp 3 in hopes to reach Jane. Send a request to Camp 3 in hopes to reach Jane. If it fails, send another request to Camp 2, which is consistent with the queue values in the response. Send a request to Camp 2 and another request to Camp 3 at the same time. So the SIP phone has multiple options, and it can choose to do any of those. So let's go over the 3xx redirection responses defined in RFC 3261. 300 multiple choices. This indicates that the called party can be reached by contacting more than one location at the moment, and the next hop doesn't want to make that decision on behalf of the caller. That's why the caller receives a 300 multiple choices response with the list of locations the called party can be reached at. Let's use an example here. If Tarzan called Jane and Jane is now reachable at multiple camps, for example Camp 1 and Camp 2, Jane's SIP proxy could respond with 300 multiple choices instead of making a routing decision and trying to send the call to Jane. The 300 multiple choices response would indicate Tarzan that he needs to send a new request and use one of the two URIs in the response contact header field. Now the 301 moved permanently. This response indicates that the called party can no longer be reached at the requested URI. The caller should try again by using the URI provided in this response's contact header field. This new URI should be cached by the caller and used in future requests. Let's say Tarzan calls Jane at Camp 1 and the SIP proxies realize she is no longer available in Camp 1. Perhaps Camp 1 is closed for good. If Jane has other phones in Camp 2 and Camp 3, the SIP proxies could respond with 301 mood permanently and have her new addresses for Camp 2 and Camp 3 in the contact header field. Here, SIP proxies would also encourage Tarzan to never try Camp 1 again to reach Jane. 302 moved temporarily. This response indicates that the called party, at the moment, cannot be reached at the requested URI. The caller should try again by using the URI provided in this response's contact header field, but this new URI must not be cached by the caller. The expires header field could indicate how long this temporary URI is valid. Well, if Tarzan called Jane at Camp 1 and nobody answered, and if Jane has other phones in Camp 2 and Camp 3, the SIP proxies could respond with 302 moved temporarily and have her new temporary addresses for Camp 2 and Camp 3 in the contact header field. The SIP proxies would also indicate Tarzan that Camp 1 phone was still operational, and next time he should try that phone again first after a certain period of time defined in the expires header field. 305 use proxy. The caller may receive this response from a called party if the called party requires the caller to go through a proxy. The caller, after receiving this response, should send a new request to the URI in the response's contact header field, which points to a proxy. Well, let's say Tarzan calls Jane, but the camp security is so tight, Tarzan has to go through another SIP proxy in order to talk to Jane. Well, Jane's phone could respond the call with 305 use proxy and provide Tarzan the SIP proxy to use in the contact header field. 380 alternative service. Now this final response defined in RFC 3261 is an indication that the call was not successful, but the caller could use another medium to reach the called party. The alternative medium would be defined in the message body of the response. Well, let's say Jane has a headache, she doesn't want to talk to anyone, but she is chatting with close friends using a chat application. Whether she unplugs the phone or simply doesn't answer the calls, when Tarzan calls Jane, he is not able to talk to her. The response from SIP proxies, however, is 380 alternative service, indicating that Jane might be reachable via chat. Did I ever tell you what the definition of insanity is? Insanity is doing the exact same thing over and over again, expecting the result to change. 4 XX responses are final responses for the respective requests. If a client doesn't change or modify the request, the result will be the same. 400 bad request, for example, means that the syntax of the request is incorrect. The request is either missing a required piece of data or it is malformed. The response may also include a reason phrase that explains the situation more. For example, missing via header field. Sending this request to the server without making any changes will result in the same response. You may recall from RFC 3261 Simplified Series Part 2 that 6 header fields are mandatory: from, to, call ID, via, C-sequence, and max forwards. Naturally, as an example, if Tarzan calls Jane but his SIP phone, for some reason, does not include one of these 6 header fields in the invite message, he could get 400 bad request response back. 401 unauthorized indicates that the caller is required to authenticate with the server, and either the caller hasn't done that yet or the caller provided wrong authentication. An important point to note here is that 401 unauthorized is a response from the user agent server or a registrar. SIP proxies do not respond with 401 unauthorized. The exact same principle applies to scenarios where the response is coming from a SIP proxy instead of a server, and the response in the scenarios would be 407 proxy authentication required. In both cases, UAC should retry the request with proper credentials to proceed. Well, when we first registered Tarzan's SIP phone in RFC 3261 Simplified Series Part 1, our initial register message did not have any authentication related header field. The registrar required authentication, therefore Tarzan's SIP phone received 401 unauthorized with www-authenticate header field, providing certain data to be used in the calculation of expected authentication value. Note that this response came from the registrar that co-resided with the SIP proxy and not from the SIP proxy itself. Tarzan's SIP phone then used the data in the www-authenticate header field and its password to calculate a value to use in the repeated register message as a part of the authorization header field. 402 payment required. This means the call cannot be completed until a payment is made. Well, let's say they deployed phone booths with SIP phones around the jungle, and they are all going over a SIP proxy that is configured to bill the callers. If Tarzan was using one of those SIP phones in the jungle and calling Jane, SIP proxy could respond with a 402 payment required before processing his call. 403 forbidden indicates that the server understood the request, but it is not going to allow it. There are different instances where the caller could end up with 403 forbidden responses. For example, let's say Tarzan is using a very old version of a SIP phone and the administrators of the SIP environment only allow recent versions due to, let's say, security flaws found in the older versions. If Tarzan tries to register his SIP phone, he may end up with 403 forbidden, with possibly explaining the situation with a warning or error line that says you are currently not using the recommended version of the client. Another common use is to avoid toll fraud and/or limit users. For example, let's say Tarzan wants to call Jane, and Jane is out of the country visiting her parents. If the administrators of the SIP environment configure the system so that locals like Tarzan can only make local calls, Tarzan's international call attempt may get 403 forbidden response. Next is 404 not found. Confusingly similar to 410 gone response, this response indicates that the server cannot locate the called party. With 404 not found, the server doesn't claim that it was at some point able to locate the called party. And it also doesn't claim that this is a permanent situation, that the called party will never be available via this server. 410 gone, on the other hand, indicates that the server was able to locate the called party in the past, but the called party is not and will never be reachable going forward via this server. Therefore, the situation is permanent. A cancelled phone service could, for example, result in a 410 gone response. Before moving on to other responses, it is worth taking a minute to get a little familiar with accept, allow, require, and supported SIP header fields. First of all, while we know what a method is, for example, register, invite, ack, buy, cancel options, we should also know that there have been additional features admitted into the session initiation protocol under the name extensions. For example, 100 rel and replaces. Only the extensions defined in RFCs are considered standard, and only those extensions should be used. With this in mind, a user agent client may add a header field called allow to list the methods it will be able to apply, and the header field called supported to list the extensions it will be able to apply. Again, the allow header field is used to list the methods, whereas the supported header field is used to list the extensions a user agent client will be able to apply. Here you can see an allow header field example and a supported header field example. Now, if the user agent client has to have an extension applied to the communication, in other words, if the user agent client must apply a specific extension for the communication to succeed, a require header field would be used instead of supported header field. If the user agent server doesn't support all of the extensions indicated in the require header field, the session will not be established, and the user agent server will reply with a response explaining which extension is the reason behind this failure. For example, if replaces and 100 rel extensions are mandatory for the communication to succeed in this scenario, the user agent client would add the following header field: require, column, replaces, comma, 100 rel. As for the accept header field, just for now, let's say a SIP message with a message body section could use the first set of header fields you see here: content type, content encoding, content language, to define the message body, and the second set of header fields, accept encoding, accept language, to indicate which message body structures are accepted. Now, going back to the 4XX responses, 405 method not allowed indicates that the method in the request line is understood but not allowed by the UAS. This response must include an allow header field listing the methods that the UAS allows so that the client can make a decision accordingly. As an example, let's say Jane's SIP phone does not support refer messages, but Tarzan's SIP phone does, and let's say they are on a call in which the methods both sides allow haven't been disclosed during the session establishment. If Tarzan at this point sends a refer message to Jane, he could receive a 405 method not allowed response with an allow header field that looks similar to the following. And note that refer is not a part of this list. Allow, column, ack, buy, cancel, invite. 406 not acceptable. This means the user agent client send a request with an accept header field that lists the content type the user agent client understands, and the user agent server understands none of them. Using the accept header field we used as an example, let's say Tarzan sends an invite message to Jane with the following accept header field: accept, column, application STP, application ISAP, application DTMF, and let's say Jane's phone only understands application/DTMF-relay content type. In this case, Jane would respond with a 406 not acceptable to Tarzan. 408 request timeout. If there is an expires header field in the request the UAS received and the UAS could not provide the response until the time given in the expires header field has passed, the UAS will respond with 408 request timeout. The UAC can retry the same request at a later time and have a different result as the circumstances could change. 413 request entity too large indicates that the request has a message body that is too large for the server. This could be a temporary situation. As a result, the response could also have a retry after header field to indicate when to retry, or a permanent situation. The user agent client could use a smaller message body, remove message body from the request altogether, or try the same request later. As an example, let's say Tarzan tries to call Jane and it is New Year's Eve, so everyone is calling each other and the SIP proxy serving Jane's camp is overwhelmed. The SIP proxy could respond to Tarzan's request with a 413 request entity too large if Tarzan's request is larger than some other requests. After the overwhelming situation ends, Tarzan's request can be processed without any issues. 414 request URI too long indicates that the server is not going to accept the URI as it is longer than it allows. Well, perhaps Tarzan could call Jane, and instead of dialing Jane's URI with IP version 4 IP address, he dials Jane's URI with an IP version 6 IP address, which is of course way longer than IP version 4 IP addresses. In this case, the URI in the request line would be much longer than usual, and the server could respond with a 414 request URI too long. 415 unsupported media type. This is basically telling the user agent client that the server does not support the format used in the message body. Depending on the problem, the response must include accept encoding, or accept language header fields to let the user agent client know what the server supports. Earlier we talked about 406 not acceptable and used a scenario between Tarzan and Jane. Let's use a very similar scenario, and let's say Tarzan sends an invite message to Jane with the following content type header field. Content type application STP. And let's say Jane's phone only understands application DTMF relay content type. In this case, Jane would respond with a 415 unsupported media type to Tarzan and have the following accept header field in the response. Accept column application DTMF relay. 416 unsupported URI scheme indicates that the user agent server does not understand the URI scheme used. As an example, if Jane's SIP phone does not support secure SIP, and yet Tarzan uses SIPs as a part of Jane's URI, Jane's phone could respond with 416 unsupported URI scheme. In this case, Tarzan's phone should retry the call with SIP instead of SIPs. 420 bad extension. An extension listed in the required header field of the request is not supported by the UAS. This response must include an unsupported header field listing the extensions that resulted in this response. User agent client should now retry the request without the extensions called out by the unsupported header field. A simple example would be Tarzan calling Jane with an invite request that has the following required header field, require replaces 100 rel, and Jane's SIM phone not supporting one or more of these extensions listed. In this case, Jane's SIP phone would respond with 420 bad extension and list the extension that caused this response in the unsupported header field. 421 extension required indicates that the user agent server requires an extension that was not listed in the supported header field. This response should include a required header field listing the extension that the user agent server requires to process the request. However, it is recommended in RFC 3261 that, if possible, the user agent server should try to process the request with whatever extensions are available, instead of responding with 421 extension required. Well, let's say Tarzan calls Jane with an invite request that has a supported header field with only extension replaces listed. If Jane's SIP phone must have 100 rel extension to properly process the call, it is recommended that Jane's SIP phone first tries to process the call without 100 rel. If it is impossible to process the call without 100 rel, then Jane's SIP phone should respond with 421 extension required and have a required header field that lists extension 100 rel. 423 interval too brief. This is basically the user agent server rejecting the request because the expiration time of the requested resource is too short for the user agent server. An example to this response would be Tarzan starting up his SIP phone, trying to register to a registrar, and using an expires header field with a value lower than the registrar is configured to allow. In this case, the registrar would respond with 432 interval too brief, and it would be expected from the user agent client to increase the expires header field value to an acceptable level before trying the attempt again. 480 temporarily unavailable indicates that the user agent server was contacted, it was reachable, but the called party was not available. This response could include a retry after header field to suggest a time for another attempt to reach the called party. It is recommended that the user agent server tries to use more explanatory responses like 486 used here if possible. Well, if Jane has a do not disturb feature enabled for her SIP phone and Tarzan calls her, Jane's SIP phone could respond with a 480 temporarily unavailable. 481 call transaction does not exist is an indication that the user agent server received the request, but the request doesn't belong to any active call or dialogue. A simple example here would be Jane's SIP phone receiving an unexpected request like buy when there is no active call. In this case, Jane's SIP phone would respond with 481 call transaction does not exist. 482 loop detected. Naturally, this response indicates that there is a loop in the environment. Let's say Tarzan calls Jane. If Tarzan's SIP proxy is sending this call to Jane's SIP proxy, and instead of sending it over to Jane, Jane's SIP proxy is sending the call back to Tarzan's SIP proxy, that would be a loop. Tarzan's SIP proxy should recognize the fact that its own via entry is already in the request and respond with a 482 loop detected. 483 too many hops indicates that an entity on this call path received this request and the max forwards header field value was 0. Unless max forwards header field is set to a value too low, this could be similar to Tarzan calling Jane and the invite request going from one SIP proxy to another, several different proxies, to a degree that max forwards header field value goes down to 0 before the invite request reaches Jane's SIP phone. 484 address incomplete indicates that the URI is not complete. This response could be used in communication with PSTN in overlapped dialing scenarios. Well, let's say Jane is out of the camp, and in order to reach her, Tarzan needs to dial her external number, 10 digits. And the SIP proxies are configured to know that the external numbers are composed of 10 digits. So if Tarzan dials an 8 digit, he may receive a 484 address incomplete response. He would receive the same response if he dialed 9 digits. The call would not be processed until he dialed 10 digits, the proper URI. 485 ambiguous. This response indicates that the URI was ambiguous, and it may include possible alternatives as contact header field values. This is obviously a privacy concern if alternatives are presented in this response. In fact, instead of this response, servers are encouraged to use 404 not found. Revisiting the 404 not found example, let's say Tarzan wants to call Jane, but he is a bit dizzy with all the swinging on the trees and types her name as Jean when he makes the call. Well, if there is nobody named Jean in the camp, or the camp servers do not have anywhere else to send this call to, Tarzan may receive 485 ambiguous response with a contact header field listing Jane as a possible alternative to unknown cold party Jean. 486 busy here indicates that the request was delivered to the cold party successfully, but the cold party is not able to take additional calls at the moment. This response may include a retry after header field to tell the UAC to retry after a certain period of time. Obviously, if Jane is on a call and she has no voicemail coverage, when Tarzan calls Jane, he may receive a 486 busy here response. 487 request terminated is a response indicating that the request being processed has been terminated by a buy or cancel request. Let's say Tarzan calls Jane, but he is in a hurry. Jane's phone rings once, and before she could answer the call, Tarzan hangs up. In this scenario, Tarzan's SIP phone would send a cancel request and receive a 200 OK response followed by a 487 request terminated response. 488 not acceptable here indicates that the specific destination resource, the endpoint, does not accept the session proposal. Other endpoints may accept this request, but this specific one does not. Perhaps Jane is using a Cisco SIP phone and it is not very compatible with the Avaya SIP phone Tarzan is using. If Tarzan calls Jane and Jane's SIP phone is unable to establish the session, whereas she could use other phones in the camp, this could be a specific issue with the endpoint Jane is using, and Tarzan may receive 488 not acceptable here response. 491 request pending is an indication that the user agent server received a resend request while processing the original. If Tarzan calls Jane, Tarzan's SIP phone sends its SIP proxy an invite request, and for some reason, before receiving a response, Tarzan's SIP phone again sends the same invite request to the SIP proxy. The SIP proxy may respond with 491 request pending, as it is already processing the same request. Without diving into security-related topics that we will be covering in other tutorials, the final 4XX client error defined in RFC 3261 can be summarized as user agent server receiving a message body that is encrypted, and the user agent server does not have the public key to decrypt it. This response could include the user agent server public key for the user agent client to use to encrypt the message body in a way the user agent server can decrypt. Now moving on to 5xx server errors, these are the responses indicating that the server itself has created an error. Internal error, for example, indicates that the server experienced an issue that resulted in the server being unable to successfully process the request. This response may include a retry after header field to tell the client to try again after a certain period of time. Well, let's say Tarzan calls Jane, both are using SIP phones. When Tarzan's invite request hits Jane's SIP phone, perhaps her laptop that's hosting the SIP soft phone was experiencing a problem, and as a result, this not so crucial process, the SIP phone call, could receive a 500 internal error response. 501 not implemented. Similar to 405 method not allowed, this response indicates that the user agent server does not allow the respective request. However, unlike 405 method not allowed, here the method is not recognized. Now going back to the example we used for 405 method not allowed, let's say Jane's SIP phone does not support refer messages, and also its software doesn't cover or know how to handle refer messages. Let's say they are on a call in which the methods both sides allow haven't been disclosed during the session establishment. If Tarzan at this point sends a refer message to Jane, he could receive a 501 not implemented response. 502 bad gateway indicates that the gateway or SIP proxy received an invalid response from the next hop the request was sent to. Let's say Tarzan uses his SIP proxy to call Jane. After Tarzan's SIP proxy sends the request to Jane's SIP proxy. If it realizes that Jane's SIP proxy is down, it may respond to Tarzan with 502 bad gateway response. 503 service unavailable. This is an indication that the user agent server is overwhelmed and its resources are not able to handle this request. This response may include a retry after header field to tell the client to retry the request after a certain period of time. If no retry after header field exists, the response should be handled the same way 500 server internal error response is handled. The user agent client that receives 503 service unavailable should try to send the request to other servers. So for example, Tarzan calls Jane. Jane is streaming video on her rather old PC that she also uses for her SIP phone. The PC is seeing CPU and memory spikes during this time period. If Tarzan's call comes in at this point, it may receive a 503 service unavailable response. 504 server timeout. This response indicates that the server sent the request to the next hop or server in the path, but it has not received a response in a timely manner. This is still a server error, even though it's not the problematic server that is sending back the client the 504 server timeout. Let's say Tarzan uses his SIP phone to call Jane. After Tarzan's SIP phone sends the request to Jane's SIP phone, if it realizes that Jane's SIP phone is down, it may respond to Tarzan with 504 server timeout response. 505 version not supported indicates that the server does not support the SIP version used in the request. Obviously, if Tarzan calls Jane and his SIP phone uses a different version of SIP that Jane's SIP phone uses, Jane's SIP phone may respond with 505 version not supported. 513 message too large is an indication that the server was not able to process the request as the message length was more than it was able to support. So moving on to the 6xx global failures, these responses are related to the called party's global presence. While the 3xx, 4xx, 5xx responses may be specific to one particular endpoint the cold party is using, 6xx responses are about all the endpoints related to the cold party. For example, 600 busy everywhere indicates that the cold party was reached at the endpoint targeted, but the cold party is busy and does not want to take the call. The cold party could also send 603 decline response if they do not wish to disclose a reason. In both scenarios, the response may include a retry after header field, indicating the time the caller should wait before repeating the attempt. Similarly, in both scenarios, there is no other endpoint available globally. For example, voicemail, chat, email, and so on. For cold party, being busy at a single endpoint would result in 486 busy here response as discussed earlier. 604 does not exist anywhere is an indication that the cold party is not available anywhere globally, as opposed to 404 not found that would be specific to a certain endpoint only. In other words, the cold party is not known by the servers available in the environment, nor do they know anywhere to send the calls to in hopes to reach that specific cold party. The final 6xx global failure defined in RFC 3261, 606 not acceptable, is a response the user agent server could send if the user agent server is contacted successfully and it is willing to communicate, but certain parts of the session description cannot be supported anywhere globally. In other words, the user agent server was reached, but the request had certain entries in the session description, perhaps in message body section with session description protocol, that cannot be supported. The response may also include a warning header field with some details about these entries. Alright, this is the end of part 3 of our RFC 3261 Simplified series. If you have any questions or comments about this video, please let us know. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.